My name is Kateryna Zelenska, and I'm based in Germany in the Düsseldorf area. At the moment, I'm a research fellow at the Brunswick School for European Law, next to Braunschweig in Wolfenbüttel. And my area of studies is international trade law with a specific focus on agriculture. I accomplished my PhD studies at the University of Bremen 2 years ago, and the result of my doctoral studies is the book we are talking about today. So it's actually my doctoral thesis. So the book is about grain subsidies in Ukraine. In fact, about grain policies and regulations in Ukraine, because I took a very, very broad subsidy notion. My idea was to examine agricultural policies in Ukraine with a specific focus on WTO law and on the cooperation with the European Union. So it's basically a legal research, and my question was, how dangerous are Ukrainian agricultural policies for the Ukrainian position in the World Trade Organization, and how dangerous they may be, or which implications they may have for their bilateral trade with the European Union. And I took as a case study the grain sector of Ukraine, because it's the most, I don't know, I would not say the most important, maybe for now the most important, but it's this sector where Ukraine has already achieved a lot of success. And maybe if everyone hears, okay, Ukraine, agricultural exporter, oh yeah, they are producing grain, they are producing cereals. So that was my idea. I took a very successful, at least nominally, a very successful sector of Ukrainian economy, and I had a look, okay, what policies does Ukraine have, and are they good or not from the legal point of view? So I do not write a lot about economics or about politics, so I was concentrated on the legal issues. That's why maybe my book is seems to be complicated for non-lawyers. So agricultural sector is at the moment the leader within the export sectors in Ukraine. I cannot give you, unfortunately, I cannot give you the figure how many percent does it have, but it's on the first place within all other export sectors in Ukraine, and the cereal sector is the largest one. And again, so just to be specific, so when we talk about grain, for the purpose of my research, I took not only cereals, but also I took the oil seed, because oil seed, according to Ukrainian legislation, they are supposed to be grain. So if you take cereals and oil seed, it would be the major part of Ukrainian agricultural exports. Let's start from the general overview, which instruments may be used by a government. So it could be direct support, so direct payments to producers, and it could be some kind of indirect support, so when the producers are not paid directly. And in Ukraine, like in the most developing states, the producers are not supported directly, so they do not get payments from the government. They are supported through some kind of other schemes. It could be credit subsidies, or it could be some kind of governmental purchases. In the case of Ukraine, the agricultural sector was supported to the major extent through the tax subsidies. So agricultural sectors was taxed at a very preferential rate. And this subsidy scheme was cancelled only a couple of years ago. At the moment, there are several other support schemes in Ukraine, but they are not as extended as these tax subsidies used to be. If you compare it with the European Union, in the European Union, agricultural producers, they receive direct support payments from the government. So the idea is, we give you this money, you take this money, and you think how you operate with this money. And actually, from the point of view of international trade law, this should be, under certain circumstances, if certain conditions are met, this should be the best option. Because in this situation, the agricultural markets are supposed to be at least distorted. When a country or the European Union, this organization, when a country becomes a member of the World Trade Organization, it acceded to all WTO agreements. And one of these agreements is agreement on agriculture. And within this agreement, there are particular disciplines, disciplines on market access, disciplines on export subsidies, and disciplines on domestic support, so on subsidies. Furthermore, by exceeding the World Trade Organization, a member also submits particular concessions regarding its agricultural sector. So it negotiates tariffs, import tariffs on agricultural products. It also negotiates the level of domestic support which it is authorized to provide to its producers. So when Ukraine became a member of the World Trade Organization in 2008, it took certain obligations in respect to domestic support. The point was that Ukraine took this level for domestic support, so this level was not really high, and it was also calculated in Ukrainian currency, in Hryvnia. But as you know, the currency is in fact not really strong, and after 2008, so there were two economic crises in Ukraine. The first one to start in 2008, just this global economic crisis. So the currency was became weaker, and then after 2014, so the currency really fell. The problem is now, so Ukraine has a specific level which should not be violated, should be preserved, but it's calculated in Hryvnia. So that's why actually Ukraine already started, as far as I know, Ukraine already started talks about recalculation of this level, because they say it's not possible for us. This money, it's really too little. So this is the point of Ukraine. The point of the European Union, in fact, European Union has a very, very good commitments compared to Ukraine. So they are allowed to provide high level of support because they took these commitments years ago during the establishment of the World Trade Organization. So that time, developed countries provided much more agricultural support than now. And the European Union actually, if you look at the situation now, provides less agricultural support than 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So these are basically very different situations, and it's not just the case of Ukraine and the European Union. This is normally the case then that developed states have, I would not say better, but better situation for agricultural policy, but they have normally more policy space within their WTO for agricultural policies, because they have been members of this organization from the very beginning, and they were lucky to have like better starting point. The point is, the structure of my research was actually this specific, I took this specific regulation for agricultural support within the WTO, I took them and I took Ukrainian regulation. I just went step by step and compared and examined whether they are inconsistent with each other. So that's why, and I don't think that we really should go step by step, because it's really like, it won't be interesting for your audience, I think. As you know, Ukrainian agricultural sector has a great potential. So everyone talks about this. The problem is that natural conditions for agriculture in Ukraine, they are very good, but what is the problem is the infrastructure. So the infrastructure in Ukraine, agriculture infrastructure, cannot meet the requirements of the market at the moment. So Ukraine cannot produce and export as much as it can because of their market infrastructure. So this is the transportation, storage, financial markets. Due to this infrastructure failure, the production costs in Ukraine, they are relatively high. And that's why the producers, they do not get as much income as they may have, because they have to invest a lot. Another issue, which is not only an issue in Ukraine, in the most developing countries, is high input prices. Producers have to pay a lot for seeds, they have to pay a lot for petrol, they have to pay a lot for energy. So this is the first, production costs and infrastructure failure. The second issue which should be targeted by the policies is the quality of products. So if you want to sell your products at good price internationally, so the product should meet certain standards, especially if you want to sell these products in a developed country, especially in the European Union. If you are an agricultural producer in Ukraine, if you're a small agricultural producer in Ukraine, you cannot target these issues by yourself. Yes, because you need some kind of support from the state. And that's why agricultural policies of the government of Ukraine, they are basically targeted on these kind of problems. The problem is that the policies, they are not designed to meet these issues on the long term. So as every developing country, Ukraine has a problem with financial, with the budget. Yeah. So, and there are two great problems which are not only specific for agricultural sector, but I would say for other sector of economies in Ukraine. These are the problems of transparency and the problem of planning. First of all, if you want to get information how agricultural budget in Ukraine is spent like a normal researcher or like a normal farmer, you will never get to this information. So the second, planning. So agricultural budget is planned only for a year, and it's normally planned at the end of December. Moreover, as a farmer, you don't know what kind of agricultural support you will get, but only at the end of December. And it's also planned very generally, you know. Moreover, if the expenditures are already planned in the budget, during the financial year, it may be changed. The agricultural sector is quite a powerful one, and very often the government of Ukraine thinks at the middle of the year, fine, so we are running out of costs and we planned this amount for agriculture. But you know, agricultural sector, they are they are really good, this year they have good harvest, they will get along. Let's take part of this money and transfer them in some other area. So as an agricultural producer in Ukraine, you cannot really plan. And I talked with some producers, some grain producers in Ukraine, and all of them, they told me one thing: we are not dealing with the state at all, because we cannot trust the state. They promise something and then they don't give it. And there are also very often, unfortunately, there are corruption schemes. So if you want to get some kind of support from the state, you have to pay part of it to the authorities or to some kind of, I don't know, intermediary persons. So most of producers, they just do not deal with the state at all. So unfortunately, most of their agricultural payments provided directly to agricultural producers, they do not reach people who really in need of it. So of course, I don't want to speak about each and every case, but this is just my impression after a couple of interviews and after the studies I was reading about. And maybe because of this situation, because of this transparency and planning program, the government of Ukraine decided at the end of the 19th, so okay, we just switch to these tax subsidies and we will just tax agricultural producers at a preferential rate. So it will be easy for us to administer this policy, and so everyone will be taxed the same. So no one will have some kind of preferences. And maybe, if generally speaking, it was the best option at that time. The problem is only that Ukraine spent too much time concentrated on these tax subsidies, and this scheme became the main, and maybe there was a couple of years when it was the only domestic support for Ukrainian producers. So I must confess, I talked only with one large agricultural producer. So, and they told me basically, yes, they just don't need any influence of the state. They don't want any actions of the state. But I talked with several mid-size and small producers, and all of them talked that they were actually in need of governmental support. I've never heard from Ukrainian producers that they wanted to have direct payments from the state. Mostly what they wanted some kind of... so the first problem was, of course, they wanted the state to eliminate corruption schemes. What was also the idea? The idea was basically credit subsidies, because credit interests in Ukraine are very high, and in the agricultural sector, sometimes they are even higher than in other sectors. That would be also nice. So actually, my impression is that Ukrainian producers, they don't want a lot from the state. What they want, they just want to have clear rules. Small and mid-sized producers really need, I think they need protection of the state from just some kind of other private persons, because let's look at the situation of most small-sized Ukrainian grain producers. So they harvest their grain at the end of the summer, and the prices fall. And a lot of them, they do not have enough storage capacities. And if they want to store their grain at the elevator, they have to pay for this. And they do not have money for this. So what they do, they have to sell their grain at the lowest prices just after the harvest. So they lose their money. I've heard and I've read that new storage capacities are being built and the situation is ameliorating. But you should understand that it's not a one-year plan. So, of course, year after year, the situation with the infrastructure in Ukraine will be better. But for this particular time, for this time of development of infrastructure, small and mid-sized producers, they need some kind of support to overcome this low prices problem. So the association agreement between the European Union and Ukraine is a free trade agreement. Like for the American or Canadian public, it's like NAFTA between the US, Canada, and Mexico. It's like this, or like the agreement between Canada and the European Union, CETA, which was signed a couple of years ago. So it's basically a free trade agreement with some non-trade chapters. And the European Union was clear to say, so this is just free trade. We are not talking about possible membership of Ukraine in the European Union. So specifically about agriculture, the European Union did not have any direct requirements on Ukraine, what Ukraine should do in the agricultural sector. It was mostly what was interesting in the negotiations before this agreement. Interesting was how much market access for agricultural products at preferential rate Ukraine can get, because the European Union is a large agricultural producer and a large agricultural importer. And actually, it does not need a lot of agricultural imports. But Ukraine is also a large agricultural exporter, and it wants to get as much preferential access as possible. The European agriculture policy is very, very complicated. So it's basically based on a complicated system of import tariffs. So the European Union has high import tariffs on products which it does not want to see at the European markets, mostly for agricultural products with high additional value. And the tariffs for basic agricultural products, they are normally very low or even at 0 point. So the idea of Ukraine was, okay, so let's get some kind of tariff rate quotas at 0 point for the products we want to sell at the European market. Because if we don't get these specific quotas, we will not be able to sell because of these high tariffs. And I think for agricultural sector, it was the most interesting point. What else? Ukraine also took an obligation to approximate its agricultural legislation to the European norms. But Ukraine is free to pick and choose their European laws, which it wants to harmonize with. So basically, it's really flexible. And there are no other really agriculture-related provisions of this agreement. So this is mostly about free trade, not about subsidies or other matters. Agricultural subsidies are explicitly excluded from the scope of this agreement. So there are some kind of obligations on industrial subsidies, but Ukraine did not, or Ukraine and the European Union did not take any commitments regarding agricultural subsidies. They decided that agricultural subsidies should be managed within the WTO. And I think this is also right, because, if you if you create multiple rules on the same topic, somehow you will get into a complex situation. So you have to be in compliance with all the rules. That's why I think that agricultural subsidies regulation is multilateral, is global, actually within the WTO. And why should the European Union and Ukraine create another set of rules for this subject? Yes, indeed, there were a couple of surprises. Yeah, the first one was the surprise that if you read about Ukrainian agricultural policies, you think that, okay, in fact, the state pays a lot into the agricultural budget, and it's in fact like this. But if you look at the situation from the economic point of view, agricultural producers in Ukraine, they are actually not supported but taxed. At least the situation was like this a couple of years ago. So it's really surprising. On the one hand, the government pays expenditures into the budget, and it's really, so the share of these expenditures is not really low compared to other developing states. On the other hand, producers in Ukraine, they are not really supported at all, so they are taxed. And for me, it was really surprising, the first. And the second, and it's somehow interconnected, actually, Ukraine does not provide any direct support to agricultural producers at all. But if you look at the calculations of domestic support in Ukraine, and I'm talking about the situation when this preferential tax regime was in force, if you look at the calculations, in fact, Ukraine provides huge amounts of agricultural supports, which are so to a certain extent, they are excused from the regulations, but economically speaking. So it's like really unlogical and surprising. So where is the money, in fact? Who is supported, in fact? And I'm not an economist. I do not have a response to these questions, but just from the legal point of view. So these two surprises. This is a very good point, and this was also, I had a subchapter on this issue. The land reform in Ukraine is a key point for the subsidies issue, I would say. You are quite right. If people cannot, so they are basically have their land in property, but they cannot sell it and they cannot buy it. So there is no land market, in fact, in Ukraine. So they cannot use this land as collateral for credits, and they cannot get credits. And if they cannot get credits, they cannot get capital, and they need this capital, and they want this capital from the state, and that's why they want also subsidy from the state. I think that the first step Ukraine should do to improve its agricultural regulations is, of course, to abolish the land purchase moratorium in Ukraine and to introduce the land market. Because now we have a really, really weird situation. There is, in fact, the land market in Ukraine, but it's in the gray area. So a lot of people, they do not need this land plots which they just inherited from their grandmothers or grandfathers, or land plots which they got themselves, but they moved to the cities and they do not deal with the agriculture at all. What they do, sometimes they just leave these land plots, sometimes they conclude some kind of lease agreements with large agricultural producers at very low prices, why should it be like this? I think that, of course, Ukraine should create legal conditions to introduce the land market, but it was decided already almost 20 years ago that Ukraine should introduce the land market after their adoption of special legislation. And I think 20 years for adoption of legislation is more than enough. So I think it's high time Ukraine introduced their law on land market, and it's high time Ukraine let people buy and sell agricultural land. And it's good that we are talking about this today, because only 2 days ago the European Court on Human Rights issued a decision which is directly connected with the land purchase moratorium in Ukraine. So the court said it was a claim of two Ukrainian people against Ukraine. They say that Ukraine, by introducing and maintaining this land purchase moratorium, Ukraine violates their property right, because they cannot sell their land plots. And the court decided that indeed Ukraine violates their property rights, and Ukraine has to adjust its legal provisions in this area. So the court cannot decide how Ukraine can improve the situation, but I think the answer is clear. So it must be a law on the land market. The situation with the land market in Ukraine, it has become international already, because this is only one example of external pressure on Ukraine. Another example is their International Monetary Fund. So Ukraine is really, really in need of financial support from this fund, and the fund said already a couple of times. So Ukraine has to accomplish land reform to get access to further financial support from our fund. And as I already said, I think that if Ukraine does not introduce land market in course of the next years, the issue of agricultural policies and of agricultural support and of income of domestic producers will not be rectified, because they are really, really interconnected. And in my book, I think that my main idea was, I was writing about subsidies, but subsidy is not the first best option. So my idea was, of course, agricultural sector is a very, very specific sector, and unfortunately, it's not possible for this sector to operate without any state policies. But let's let the market works, and let's have a look. Okay, here we have a market failure. Here it does not work as good as it could be, and then the state can intervene. But let's just try without the state. Let's just try without the subsidies. So that was my idea. And it's also good for Ukraine. I think this strategy may also be good for Ukraine, because differently from the European Union, differently from the United States, differently from Canada and other developed states, Ukraine is a new state, and it does not have this tradition of largely supporting agricultural producers. So now it is possible, but in 10, 20 years, I don't think that it will be a good time for this. There is a conflict between developed and developing states regarding agricultural policies, and it does not seem that they can overcome this conflict of interest. So plainly speaking, there is such major player as India, who is talking on behalf of a lot of other developing states who are telling directly, we think that agricultural policies of developed states are not fair. We think that we cannot maintain our agricultural policies without subsidies. Basically, to understand the situation, developed states, they have provided agricultural support in very, very large volumes for years. And then they say, okay, so now we don't want it because it's really market distortive. And they came to the point where they were able to reduce the volume of domestic support, and when they were able to provide support only in the forms which are not as trade distortive as it used to be. And the developing states, they are basically now in the situation where developed states were 50, 30 years ago. And they say, we don't now have these resources to provide these green subsidies, these non-market distorting subsidies. We want to provide subsidies as you used to do. Why should we skip this stage? Why should we be now really market-oriented if you were not market-oriented? Because the subsidies of the European or of the Canadian or of the Australian model, they are really, they cost a lot. So they need more complicated administration. They have also, the approach is different. In the most developing states, the main problem is we need bread or rice prices to be low. Yeah, this is the main problem. And yeah, the main problem of developed state, we need our agricultural producers have enough income. Yeah. So developing states, they think mostly about consumers. Developed states, they think mostly about producers. Let's put it like this. Ukraine, I don't know. That was also one point in my book. So there are countries which are mainly on the producer side. There are countries which are mainly on the consumer side. And Ukraine is somehow in the middle. So there are some policies which are not really producers friendly. So very often Ukraine introduces export duties on export oriented agricultural products, and producers have to pay. On the other side, consumer prices increase, and the more Ukraine exports, the more consumers pay for bread and for other agricultural goods. It's very tricky, and I think that in my book there are more questions than answers. Unfortunately, I tried to to answer all of them, but it was not possible. What is interesting here, so normally if you conclude a free trade agreement with a country, all free trade partners of this country will be willing to conclude a free trade agreement with you. So this is like, like a reaction. Why it's like this? Because if you import some goods like at zero import tariff, there is also a danger that not only the goods from this country, but also the goods from the free trade partners of this country will get to your market, and you do not have interest in so many goods. And that's why when Ukraine started negotiation with the European Union about the free trade agreement, Ukraine, so I suppose it was like this. The European Union said, okay, so you have to look which countries we have free trade agreement with, or which countries we have planning trade agreement with, and you have to negotiate free trade agreements also with the countries. And I suppose that Ukraine started free trade agreement negotiations with Canada also because of this, because of the CETA agreement between Canada and the EU, which was negotiated. Normally it's a tendency, but it's not usually like this. Ukraine has free trade agreement with Russia and other CIS countries, but the European Union does not have any free trade agreement and does not plan any free trade agreement with these countries. The European Union has free trade agreements with Chile and with South Africa, but Ukraine does not plan it. I would suggest that Ukraine introduces a practice of agricultural budget for at least 3 or 5 years ahead for a better planning, and I would also prohibit to amend agricultural practice at least in course of one financial year. And I would also publish all information regarding agricultural policies and especially regarding agricultural expenditures online, because unfortunately you will not get any official information about the public money spent on agriculture in Ukraine. So in the European Union, you can get this information, how much in each country farmers have got. In Ukraine, it's not possible. So I think these two issues, transparency and planning, if they are targeted, it's already a very good start. The second point is, of course, the land reform. I've also already talked about this. I would suggest to introduce the law on land market as soon as possible, with some restrictions, of course. It's clear that land market cannot be introduced overnight. The next, I would expand the structure of trade representations of Ukraine abroad, and I would also introduce people who were dealing directly with agricultural trade. Just for you to compare, I was a fellow at the Free Trade Organization in Geneva a couple of years ago, and I had some contacts with Ukrainian embassy, with Ukrainian trade mission, and there were only 2 people dealing with world trade law in Ukraine, in Ukrainian representations, compared to 20 people for the United States. I mean, of course, Ukraine cannot be compared with the United States, but I would say at least 2 people for their organization. It's really little, and I would say it's not only in Geneva. I think Ukraine needs more trade diplomats abroad to protect Ukrainian agricultural trade interests. And the last but not least, I would say, Ukraine should produce and export more agricultural products with additional value. So the more additional value, the more profit for producers, the more profit also for the states, because the state will have also more tax revenues. But here it's also tricky. So normally, if you want more additional value, you introduce some kind of regulatory measures. So you put, for instance, an export tax on basics products. So I don't know if you are aware, but in Ukraine there has been export duty on sunseed for last, I don't know, 20-25 years. So if you want to export sunseed from Ukraine, you have to pay export tax. It was reduced, but it's still on. But if you want to export sunseed oil from Ukraine, you don't have to pay any taxes. I mean, yeah, it works. It works because Ukraine produces very large amounts of sunseed oil, and I think it's one of the largest exporters in the world. But let's think about sunseed producers. So what they have low prices on their products because of this. Because if they sell it on export, they would have got much more income, but they cannot because of this tax. So, I mean, additional value is very, very important, but the government should introduce also measures which should not distort the market. There are a lot of talks about Ukraine and the European Union and this bilateral agricultural trade exchange, but I tell you, the European Union, it's only 500 million consumers who have more than enough domestically produced goods. But if you look at China, at India, at Iran, at North Africa, there are much more people there who do not have domestically produced goods, and they want to consume. Because grain is not only for bread, grain is also for feed, for cattle, for poultry. And in my book, I think I made it clear that Ukraine has also to make diversification. So, of course, it's very good to export to the European Union, but it should not be the goal. The goal of Ukraine should be to export as much as possible to all countries all over the world. And Ukraine is doing well, I think, because if you look at the statistics, actually, it's not the European Union which is on the first place within the Ukrainian importers. If you look, for instance, at Ukrainian wheat, almost 30% of Ukrainian wheat is exported to Egypt. If you look at barley, at most 40% is exported to Saudi Arabia. If you look at maize, at corn, okay, Spain consumes a lot, but also South Korea and China. And so my vision, Ukraine has to expand the Asian markets, first of all, and China would be also great, but Chinese market is unfortunately quite, so it's not open. Ukraine was lucky enough to get some access to Chinese market, and Ukraine is exporting cereals to China, but Chinese market has also so quotas for importation, and unfortunately Ukraine cannot get enough quotas for this. I don't know if you read, there is also a sub-chapter about Ukraine-China cooperation, cereals cooperation in my book. So there is a governmental contract between Ukraine and China about the supply of Ukrainian cereals to China. So it's basically like a credit. Ukraine takes money to supply goods, and Ukraine also has to purchase some Chinese goods for agricultural sector. And I think that if it's managed correctly, it would be an interesting example, and Ukraine can cooperate like this not only with China but also with other countries. Unfortunately, this project was somehow, there was some corruption schemes, and it does not function as well as it could. There are some problems, and allegedly Ukraine did not supply the goods to China, or supplied but the goods did not reach China. So, but I mean, the idea is very interesting. So Ukraine cannot support own producers, but Ukraine can get money in advance from other countries, can purchase cereals at good prices in Ukraine, and can export these goods to other countries. So it's basically a win-win situation. Ukraine manages the problem with financial support, and other countries, they have security. So Ukraine has to export. Ukraine has to provide the supply. So I would say that it would be really a success story if Ukraine can manage it. What I wanted to say, what a message. There are actually a lot, and it's very good that you asked me about from quite other point of view, because I was writing my book thinking as a lawyer, yeah, and normally I think as a lawyer, but if I got some questions like from business point of view, or I don't know, from other point of view, it's really, it's for me very important to change this perspective, because I don't think like you and you don't think like me. And if you ask me to give a message to business people, I really have to think about it. Okay, what business people are actually interested in? So when I was writing this book, when I was doing this research, I was thinking all the time that it's really a pity that Ukraine has such a large agricultural potential, and still there are so many problems, and I unfortunately do not see really desire of the government to solve these problems. It's my impression. What I can also see, I see this desire on the side of the privates. I think in Ukraine, trade associations, business people, agricultural NGOs, they do in fact more than the government. And I would like to encourage the state to work more with this private sector, and I would like to encourage the state to think more on a long term. And I would also, I hope that my book may somehow help people who are dealing with agriculture, and I hope that there will be more people who will be dealing with agricultural trade aspects. And I'm encouraging these private actors to go ahead and not to stop. I'm very happy when I read about new success of Ukrainian agricultural producers. It's really and I'm happy when I read about some effective steps of Ukrainian government. For instance, it was really a pleasure for me. I wrote in my book that tax subsidies in Ukraine must be abolished, because from the legal point of view, Ukraine may be in danger within the WTO. Ukraine can be claimed because of these tax subsidies. And I was very happy when at the end of 2016, at the end of December, the Parliament of Ukraine decided to abolish these tax subsidies. So I hope that my book may be helpful somehow for the government, for the private actors. I hope that some kind of predictions which are not really good, I hope they will never come true. I do hope that Ukraine will be able to use its huge agricultural potential, and not only large agricultural producers, agri-holdings. We have actually most of them, they are not based in Ukraine. Not only they will get some kind of profits from the agricultural success of Ukraine, but I do hope that also the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian state will also be among the winners of this success of Ukrainian agriculture. And I hope that Ukraine will also liberalize its agricultural trade, and this agreement with the European Union, it will be only the beginning, so it's a good start. I hope that Ukraine will be able to get more free trade agreements, or other agricultural agreements with a lot of other states of the world. And I hope that one day I will be able to read that Ukraine has become the first producer and the first exporter of grains. I think that Ukraine may do this. Yeah, thank you a lot for inviting me.